what is identity and what is psychosis? So identity being the topic of this lecture series, which we had a beautiful introduction, last time about the history of how it, comes to be in mankind. But I want to preface, and I am going to go over the definitions of identity. So we have a really strong working definition, but I want to background everything I'm going to say with this concept that I am going to call, taking from the Lacanian theory, the fall of the paternal metaphor. And what this means is in recent times, we could say, but I would argue, really since the death of God, if you will, that there has been a diminishing role of the father figure. But what I mean by that more generally is, and why they call it the paternal metaphor, is the role of the father, a paternal, indeed at times patriarchal role that is the same constitution of institutions that make up what we could call social reality. So institutions such as the nation state, I say, this sort of starts with when people stop believing in God, right? So when the father himself falls out of the picture and starts diminishing, and you see it in institutions of government, the institution of money is not as sacred as it used to be. And then especially, the institution of marriage, for example, almost no one gets married today. And the concept itself, which is probably originally predicated on biological reasoning, which then becomes social. And maybe someone like John could help with that, but nonetheless, no one is getting married and they don't even know about what the connotation of that, just one example, there was a sort of notion that the man would mature, with the woman, that it was, in other words, that marriage was part of a developmental path, and it's not even recognized as such, and no one does it anymore. And so, and then, you can also say the institution of gender, for example, which it would be exactly correct. That is to say, the conventions and the agreements that we have as a society, something about that, along with the actual role and importance of the father within the family structure. We hardly have fathers now. I mean, quite literally, a great amount of young people that just didn't grow up with fathers. And then the role of the traditional father, which, and we'll get into this, is not necessarily a pretty one. Indeed, by Freud's accounts and others, there's many reasons why, the father is he who enacts castration. The father is he who punishes. The father is he who says no. The father is a restrictive agent that says you can't completely enjoy. So in other words, the father is someone that you would want to kind of block out, and it makes sense that people, don't want to deal with them. But I'm saying even in the family role, it's especially when it comes to the classical role of, he who prohibits, that law, he who lays down the law, that is diminishing, even if there is a man in the relationship and so forth. So does everyone, like, and I guess you don't have to agree if it exists or not, but can everyone sort of sense that and gets the concept, at least, of the fall of this sort of these meaning-making mechanisms of the church, of God himself, of the father, of the institutions, of the academy, Does it make sense that that's kind of breaking down? Because I just want to get across that one concept, because that is what predicates my argument that essentially everyone is more psychotic today, and it also backgrounds the French Lacanian idea of ordinary psychosis. But if anyone has a question about that, and if you want me to clarify something in general throughout, please do point it out. You know, if it's substantial times. So I just want to make sure everyone gets that, and I was able to get that across, of this idea of the fall of the paternal metaphor. Because now I'm going to go into, you know, what is identity? We have been talking about it. I just want to give some more, you know, authoritative and just really lay down a good working concept, so the rest makes sense. I'm going to start identifying identity with some dictionary definitions. So, can you still see me? So here is from a big old dictionary that I used as a child, actually, which is important because I think your first, you know, not only are your first words obviously very crucial for Lacan. He's going to say this is the moment of development. But reading, right, at an early age is similar to how writing, you know, works for setting up the nature of society, right? Laws are written down. The law is a written entity. As that was so interesting, this point John makes of the first I am being inscribed in Norway, essentially. You know, how you know, the word becomes flesh by being written down into the whatever is canonical, but the law is typically the most. So, you know, whether it be the social law of government, the natural law, or, you know, the law up above, which indeed, you know, comes down on those tablets. Okay, so here's the dictionary definition of identity. Number one, the collective aspect of the set of characteristics by which a thing is definitively recognizable or known. Number two, the set of behavioral or personal characteristics by which an individual is recognizable as a member of a group. And so let's keep this in mind when I bring up identity politics and how we take our identity from the other, from the group, in order to solidify ourselves as part of a clan. Three, the quality or condition of being exactly the same as something else. And that I think you see, for example, in logic and other fields where you know, identity is you know, a definitive form that can, for example, can match the other one. So there is indeed a mimicry element in all of identity, and I'm about to go over that as well, but let's keep that in mind. Four, the quality or condition of being or remaining the same. That's a really interesting question for us. The question of, is one's identity stable? For example, today you hear, and again, I think this is because everything is breaking down, the structure is breaking down. You hear of people having a fluid identity. You know, but is that really possible? Is that really true? I actually tend to think that one has a core identity, and let's keep that in mind when we hear the word psychotic core, but that one tends to have some sort of core ontological identity, and I believe one gets alienated from that in various different ways. And I think one job of the analyst, for example, is to bring one back into alignment with an original identity. So I actually don't think we have multiple identities, but it's interesting that that is at the core of the definition of the word identity, right? The quality or condition of being or remaining the same. 5, the personality of an individual regarded as a persisting entity. So that's related to that question. Then there's finally a mathematical definition, which is fascinating, but I would need to get into it much more. I might as well read it though. An equality satisfied by all values of the variables for which the expressions involved in the equality are defined. Maybe we'll take that up formally at another time. But that is the dictionary definition, and then, you know, how we think of it as we, you know, engage with identity is in the sense of, so again, you know, and John David went over this a little bit, of that which constitutes the I, you know, and that's why ego in the German is literally it, is I, and in French, le moi, the me, right? So we use it, for example, in the when you say the phrase, I don't even know myself anymore. You know, that me is, you know, how you are represented in the projection you see yourself as, and society, the other. That's a, you know, and that term really does in most ways come from Lacan. And when you hear that term, you know, that group is being othered all the time now, because they've got feminist discourse and academic discourse, and it has spread now. But that really comes from Lacan, who there's a developmental aspect to it. And I'm going to go into that. I just want to say, so now are we on the same page as far as having some sort of, I'm still going to go over the psychoanalytic definition of identity. I just want to make sure everyone's still with me. Can you at least still hear me?
I think everyone's very engaged and still with you. Yeah,
okay.
Awesome.
And by the way, I should say, you know, when I speak, I consider myself one of these sort of millennial psychotics. And I think one of our tendencies is to be a bit withdrawn from reality, so as to need a check-in to know that you're still going. And I think it's very prevalent and prescient for our time in working in therapy, which I'll get to at the very end, but especially in our time of COVID, right? You're never quite sure if you're with them or not.
Is this is it what you call the secretary or something along those lines?
That's what I'm going to get at the very end, where, you know, I'm going to say a better name for us is what these old psychiatrists use, the secretary of the alienated subject. Yes.
Okay, but we're all with you. It's, yeah, so far so
good. Well, so I just want to quickly go over the idea of the other, so I can say something about psychoanalytic and Lacanian definition of identity. The other really starts out as the mother. And what this means is, you know, this is obviously pretty much established in sort of any psychological frame of mind, is that the, classically speaking at least, typically, or at least we hope to some degree, that a baby is raised by its mother or primary caretaker for the most part, and indeed takes its identity from the mother. And in turn, incidentally, the mother takes a little bit from the baby, but the baby's a blank slate and there's not much there to take from. So nonetheless, you start relating, you learn to relate through your mother first. You know, this is a pretty standard developmental account. But it's interesting that you take from her identity. But so it starts from the beginning. Identity is a borrowing mechanism that you take on the traits, and that also, you know, maybe the facial expressions, the way, you know, you are caressed and so forth. You mimic them. There is an element of mimicry both in the cognitive identification and at the level of desire. But so that mother really then generalizes, that mother, in object relations terms, the mother object generalizes to the everyone else, really, the other in general. the crowd. So when I say other, you can, and really, even if they don't realize it, it's what is entailed in the word itself. The other is that there's this originates as the mother and then sort of abstracts into a collective form. And this identity is how we constitute the self, and how we can't, especially for Lacan, who is, I'm not going to go into it, but he believes that we're really not humans in a way until we enter into what he calls the symbolic, basically until we learn language. In some fundamental sense, this is correct, right? And historically, as John pointed out, right, what Descartes is doing, je pense donc je suis, is putting it into words, and it becomes a philosophical problem by putting it into that phrase. I think, therefore I am. I use language, therefore I am. I can establish a concept of self. I can establish a concept of I. Without language, it's pretty amorphous, and you're not grasping, you're not putting concepts to things. You have to put a word, or more specifically, a name around the concept you're trying to grasp. So it does have to be grasped in language. Now that's a skeptical theory for the reason you'll see, because I'm about to describe what the name of the Father is. But for Lacan, he actually never talks about actual father in the sense we use it in ordinary language, but he speaks of the name of the Father. What this means, what the Father is called, but it's technically a standard philosophy term from Kripke mainly, that means the name. It's been this debate has been there since the Cratylus. Was it Aristotle? Or Plato actually? Correct me which one it is, John. But it's to say that the name of something, the actual phonemes, the sounds we give to something like the word chair is not actually the chair, right? The chair signifier is just the name for that thing we call a chair. So when Lacan says the name of the Father, this doesn't have to be the actual Father. It typically is, but it doesn't have to be. And to the extent that, for example, a woman's job, a mother's job that has all of her attention could function as the name of the Father. Because really what it is, and here's the developmental part, is the Father is he who injects, who inserts reality, some sense of reality, the reality principle in Freudian terms, into the equation of the love, mimicry, and identification between the mother and the child. Does that make any sense? Both this idea of the triangulation, that the baby is with the mother and the Father is the role that interjects. And does it make sense, the concept of the name of the Father, something which stands in for the Father? Because the name of the Father and paternal metaphor mean the same thing. It's a synonym. So fall of the name of the Father, fall of the paternal metaphor. Does that generally make sense to anyone? You can nod your head if yes. Okay, good. Okay, so let me know if you have questions, because now we're about a third way through and I can start elaborating. Half an hour, I can start elaborating my theory. But first, I have to now give a working definition of psychosis. Okay, however, before we get into psychosis, I did want to very briefly read the psychoanalytic working definition of identity. So this is from the Penguin Standard Dictionary of Psychoanalysis. Identity, the sense of one's continuous being as an entity distinguishable from all others. According to Erikson, And by the way, Erikson is really who brings about identity theory, and he's really what was better known in the 70s and so forth. Kind of a mix between developmental, like Piaget style psychology and what you could call developmental psychology. And object relations kind of stuff. But so according to Erikson, many aspects of ego development, and so that's important because identity at the level of metapsychology is at the level of the ego, right? Again, ego. According to Erikson, many aspects of ego development can be formulated in terms of the growth of the sense of identity. An identity crisis, and incidentally, I think that is what we are in collectively as a society recently, is an identity crisis of greater or lesser severity being characteristic of late adolescence and early adulthood. And indeed, you hear all the time about this, generation me, millennials, that adolescence is prolonged. And indeed now with COVID, with everyone moving back to their parents, it's going to be even more prolonged. Adolescence is a much longer period now. And adulthood, if it ever comes, takes even longer. The sense of identity is lost in fugues and perverted in schizophrenic delusions of identity. This is going to be important for the next topic of psychosis, because in what we all know what schizophrenia is, I'm going to go over it again, but they're saying in schizophrenia, identity, the sense of identity is lost in fugues and perverted in delusions. Perverted is taking it a bit far, but I think that says something about us, and let me get there. So let me just finish the definition. In which typically an underlying sense of non-entity is compensated for by delusions of grandeur. Many of the problems about identity center around the part played by identifications in enhancing or diminishing identity. And so, for example, when people say we're all more narcissistic today, that is, correct in a lot of ways. But what it means, by the way, incidentally, is that they never stop identifying with the mother. It doesn't mean they're identifying with themselves in the mirror in the sense of narcissistic personality disorder. It means that they're over-identifying with their, needs being met all the time, and this mimetic, mirror. And this is big for Lacan. It's what his whole reference of the mirror stage, where all his development comes from, is this time of where the mother and the child are mirroring each other, and then the child learns to see itself in the mirror, and so forth. But it's not narcissistic personality disorder. What it is being stuck with mom, to put it bluntly. Failure to identify with parents. Many of the problems about identity center around the part played by identifications in enhancing or diminishing identity. Failure to identify with parents. And now this is sort of old school, and you can see from this book, sort of 1950s American Freudianism, which isn't necessarily the case. But many of the problems about identity center around the part played by, failure to identify with parents, particularly the parents of one's own sex during childhood, is held to diminish the sense of identity, but failure to disidentify with them in adolescence has a similar effect. The sense of identity is probably synonymous with self-awareness and can be regarded as the subjective equivalent of the ego, which psychoanalytic theory tends to use only objectively. It is not clear whether the search for identity, this is an example. It is not clear whether the search for identity, which preoccupies many American writers, is a search for a role or for enhanced self-awareness. Okay. So from here on out, I'm going to speak a little bit more psychoanalytically, but I'm going to try to make it for a lay audience and as clear as possible. But please ask me to clarify terms. And for example, am I speaking way too loud right now? I can't tell.
You're Your sound is perfect, Peter.
Okay. I heard the slip.
Did you?
So then let's go from that last definition of identity, though I will give one more definition for the process of how one takes in identification, because now we're going to talk more at the level of, the psychological, the metapsychology, because now I want to get a working definition of psychosis. So psychosis is a general psychoanalytic / psychiatric nosological category, and we most commonly refer to it with schizophrenia. Everyone knows what schizophrenia is, the more extreme form of being mad, right? The one typically associated with losing all your marbles is the schizophrenia, with the word salad and so forth, which comes from, as any Psych 101 class will point out, it's not multiple personality disorders. It means from the Greek. I had it up here on the mirror, but the split mind is how they always translate schizo, like schism, phrenia. And here it's sort of like mind being, split mind, split being. However, I want to focus in, really look at the level of the letter, to use the Lacanians' favorite phrase, to really just concentrate on the word itself, because really the Greek is actually more like to split. He or she who splits. So it's the person who does splitting, the person who splits. So splitting, I'm sure most of you know what it is, but splitting is a psychological and psychoanalytic term for what you see in schizophrenia and what you see in just realized the elections are still on TV. What you see in so-called personality disorders, which is it's easier to give examples. The most common example of splitting is so-called black and white thinking, where a more adjusted, more normal, neurotic, and we'll get into that, right? Because I think to understand what psychosis is, we have to understand what neurosis is, what it's not. Because neurosis is the other category, the two big categories of psychoanalysis, but also for psychiatry. I'm turning up my phone so you guys aren't annoyed by that for the rest of it. Splitting. So for example, now I saw the elections, right? In the corner of my eye, so that reminds me of, Trump splits all the time, right? So Trump can't bear, right now he can't bear the idea that he lost an election. I literally, when I came out of the shower, he tweeted, "I won the election by a lot." And he immediately got sort of troll status. Someone, reported him immediately, which it must be terribly frustrating. But he does the same thing with fake news, right? Fake news that he doesn't like, news that goes against what fits his worldview becomes not news. It becomes fake news. It becomes bad. So the typical example is an object, meaning a person or a thing for that matter, confronts the person, and immediately it's either good or bad. It's either idealized or degraded and hated and something of oppressive. And it comes incidentally from object relations. Melanie Klein, the idea that the baby, the child, splits off what she calls the breast, which is good breast, bad breast. And that's the sort of psychoanalytic lineage of this object relations idea, which by now is sort of mainstream psychology. Another example of splitting Well, there's a lot of examples of splitting of for those who saw it, I made a list for the first lectures of traits that I saw in millennial societies, and almost every, I have it in front of me, almost everyone engages in some sort of splitting, which, okay, is functioning. Splitting happens at the same locus, the same location as identity. Right, this is really crucial because you identify, to put it bluntly, right, you identify with the good, but you also identify with the bad. But I think today you see incredible difficulties of only identifying with your specific category. I'm a vegan feminist, and that's who I am. I really am that. You have to respect me. You have to accept my identity. And I'm trying to give another example of splitting, and maybe someone can help me here because they will come to me. The act of canceling the other, the so-called cancel culture, that is a splitting move because you want to just block out and remove the other that is causing you so much anguish. Rather than manage them, you just split them off. You cancel them, you put them out of sight. Does that make sense at all? Because this is one of the trickiest things. If we can get this splitting, then the rest will fall into place. But so the schizophrenic, I wanted to not concentrate on this on the schizophrenic, but on the word that originally described schizophrenia. And so incidentally now, schizophrenia is what we usually generally associate with psychosis, even though schizophrenia is just a sort of, one category, one diagnostic within the general structure of psychosis, which was originally, from the father of psychiatry, Emil Kraepelin, dementia praecox, which was actually early onset dementia. It was not schizophrenia, but this is where we start thinking about it. And then there's he makes the distinction actually between, so both of these are the so-called Kraepelin distinction, where the two kinds of psychotics are either schizophrenic or manic depressive, right? And that's still to this day. Bipolar and schizophrenia are the two main psychotic diagnostics for what antipsychotics would be prescribed for example. And that is and then later it was Eugene Bleuler who names it schizophrenia, incidentally. And a lot of what I'm going to be saying, as you'll see, as we do the second half, it revolves around looking at early psychiatrists. Because when I went back and looked at how the early psychiatrists, like Kraepelin, like Bleuler, like Sullivan, Kalboom, a lot of these people, Meyer, Freud himself, when they were originally looking at, these sort of original psychotic subjects, what they were calling before he termed it dementia praecox in various ways, psychotic, and then also it's the first time they're seeing autistic people, and they noticed that they were autistic, sort of in a shell, the one. The early reading through the reviews, historical reviews of the concept of schizophrenia, how these early psychiatrists described schizophrenia was kind of off, and we've corrected it over the years. However, what was so intriguing to me is what they do describe is very similar to millennials. So the schizophrenic, read literally as he or she who splits, if you go and read a lot of the literature, it looks like today's kids, like today's contemporary subjects, okay? That's my sort of nosological kind of claim for the day. But I just wanted to, before I wrap up psychosis, give a developmental account. And basically, what does Freud and what does Lacan mean by psychosis, and then also what is to try to again establish what is psychosis. I have to say that is in contrast to neurosis. Freud originally said neurosis is a normal person. To Freud, it's someone who has gone through castration, and same for Lacan, and has taken on the name of the father. The neurotic accepts, and now I'm going to do this on the board, the neurotic accepts, to some extent, unconsciously, the name of the father being installed. Does that make sense? I'm going to talk about the Oedipus for Freud and Lacan now, but that the neurotic is a normal person, right? Woody Allen is a neurotic. So a neurotic, you would say he suffers from normal things more than others, but still is more or less, one, not schizophrenic. We can sort of intuitively grasp that, right? And Woody Allen is not a schizophrenic, right? But he is neurotic. Yeah? And so it's normal. Neurotic means normal. A psychosis being the special category, the other category. It's for another time, but I actually think that's incorrect. I think it's the reverse. I think neurosis was just sort of a cultural blip on the historical radar, and that we're actually in a sort of Hegelian return to the beginning, to being closer to animals on a curve towards psychosis. But nonetheless, for all other definitions, normal is neurotic and psychotic is this other. And for Lacan, it means never having the name of the father installed in the period of development that Freud calls the Oedipus complex. Was I at all somewhat clear there? And do we have a working definition of psychosis now?
For sure, yes.
Okay, so I'm going to give an example of how this development works, where one would become psychotic, if you can call it that, by how Lacan formulates it in the Oedipus complex as a way to introduce his son-in-law's concept of Jacqueline Miller of ordinary psychosis, and my concept is closely related to ordinary psychosis. Mine's a bit different. I'm calling it something like everyday psychosis or millennial psychosis, which is what I'm really talking about. Is this generation called millennials? But you'll see why I want to go through Jacqueline Miller's definition. So this is the neurotic. I'll write it. Here's the psychotic, and here's the ordinary psychotic millennial psychosis. What I'm gonna, now I'm getting to my argument, my theory. But I'm going to explain the ordinary psychosis. So, can you see the board at all?
We can.
It's okay. I'll write these big things, you'll get it. Left one, neurosis. Middle, psychosis. Let's call this everyday, ordinary, millennial psychosis. The point is in between in some extent, right? So ordinary psychosis is a concept of, I went into it the first lecture when I read Alan Rowan's work. Ordinary psychosis is a concept from French analysts working in the Lacanian manner under Jacqueline Miller and the World Association of Psychoanalysis. And in France, it's basically like the Lacanians against the American-inspired CBT people. For example, when they were waging the guerre du autisme, the autism wars, it was a fight between whether the Lacanians' idea, which is not popular, by the way, and psychosis needs a makeover. In the same way, hysteria needs a makeover. It's a fantastic concept, but you're not going to go very far with using these terms. The Lacanians insist on using them, incidentally, and it's really stupid. It just scares everyone away, especially today in this sort of obsession with anti-stigma movement. Anyway, so in France, you've got one of my sort of jobs on this planet, I guess, is to translate the French of all people into working, you know, American and English concepts. And it's not exactly easy, as you can see. But so the Lacanians, if you will, if you excuse my French, they have this concept of ordinary psychosis, which comes in the past 15 years or so after working with patients that were sort of neither neurotic or psychotic. You know, they had some psychotic traits, but they had never been, had hallucinations, for example. Oh, and I had skipped that part. I didn't do a dictionary definition of psychosis. What you find in the dictionary about psychosis and schizophrenia is a withdraw from reality. Right? And we know that. That is, schizophrenics have hallucinations and delusions. But you can have a psychotic structure, but never be floridly psychotic. You know, so you're not schizophrenic, but you have what we call, Lacanians call, a structure. We have two structures, psychosis and neurosis. So it's, you know, similar to the psychiatric nosologies. We do call it structures, though. So neurosis is a structure, and it has the, let's put NP, name of the nom du père, name of the father. It has the name of the father installed in it. That subject, the neurotic accepts more or less. It's a very painful to accept, right? But the interjection of reality, of harsh reality, from the father figure, from the name of the father onto it, you know, it's the father says, you and your mother are not the whole world. You are not just the object of your mother's desire. There's also me, you know, and she screws me, for example. You're not just with her. It makes the triangulation, and it's a brutal imposition by saying you can't have it all. You know, it's why Lacan is saying the subject himself, everyone is divided because we are split between two people, which then become, again, the mother becoming the other. Well, then the father also becomes the other. And this is how people and humans and objects are, you know, as an amalgamation, receive us as everyone else, the other, society, culture, and so forth. And by the way, all of this, I think, is mimicked in society. So for example, just before I move away from schizophrenia completely, the split mind right now, you know, I'm an American, I'm here, you know, it's been almost a week now of being what, like 49.6% against 49.4%. The country is split down the line. You know, we might have something like a civil war. We'll certainly have, we already are in an ideological civil war, but I think this splitting process happens at the social level as well, right? This bifurcation. It's not multiple fragments. No, it's two. And that's important. It's a bipolarization of black and white, a good and bad, a splitting. Okay, neurosis. At the name, has the name of the father installed. That means there's castration. That means there's repression. This is where the psychotic is different. There is no repression in psychosis. Schizophrenics don't have repression. This is why Freud said you could not work with them. However, we know you can indeed work with them. And at the end, I'm going to explain how you would work with people without repression, because these people today have canceled their subscription to the unconscious, if you want to call it that. That metaphysical world is not available to them because they have something like a halfway repression. It's not functioning. The name of the father, that role is not functioning for today's subjects, but at its hard end of the psychotic spectrum, if you will, is schizophrenia. So you have psychosis, no name of the father, meaning no repression, no imposition of reality, right? So this is how Lacan graphed it out. And then we're going to put the black lines, you know, to say that it's like a void, right? It represents a void of, you know, where the name of the father should be or shouldn't be. That is castration. So the same thing as castration for Freud. And because most of you are familiar with, you know, basic assumptions of Freud, I believe, right? Let me know about that, because, and then here's the ordinary psychosis, which Jacques-Alain Miller writes like this, where he says, there's something in the place where the name of the Father is that he calls a compensatory make-believe. Compensatory make-believe. Compensatory, which is very important, because compensatory is there since the very beginning. Schizophrenia is a compensatory defense. I think it was in there when I read you that the psychoanalytic definition of identity. Yes, an underlying sense of non-entity is compensated for by delusions. So this is, and fantasies are a bit lighter than delusions. Delusions almost suggests, he's really out there. They've really gone bonkers. They are, and borders even on hallucinations, right? But fantasy, I would say, is more what millennials today essentially, are. This is what explains, for example, ADHD. That they're sort of trapped in this pre-castration, what Lacan would call the imaginary, before castration, before language, your world, and this is in all cognitive science and all psychology. You cannot tell the theory of mind, right? You cannot tell the difference when you're before language, when you're just identifying with your mom, you can't tell the difference between you and the other. You can't tell the difference between you and your mother. You think you're the same thing as the mother. That is all three, incidentally. It's a hallucination, a delusion, and a fantasy. The baby is psychotic, right? This is the other, by the way, this is the more psychoanalytic definition of psychosis. Basically, someone who, but autism in France is considered, it wouldn't go over well here in the States, I'll tell you that, but it's considered a psychosis, right? But it makes a lot of sense. The autist doesn't leave its shell. It's as if they're still in the womb in a lot of ways. So the idea is that they've unconsciously canceled out reality and stick to this autistic shell of dyad between the baby and the mother. That's the belief. They believe that it's a kind of, but you can see that because all these psychiatrists at the beginning of psychiatry say the exact same thing about autism. They say that they're in their own world, that they're in a bubble, but we can sort of intuitively see that, right? So that's the sort of psychoanalytic notion in various ways. Like Michael Egan is famous for saying this, the psychoanalytic core. And by the way, that core of identity, I think we do all have a psychotic core, and that core of identity, the beginning, is part of, it's the same thing as psychosis. It's the genesis, the root of the mind. That before it's corrupted by, when the Greeks talked about the idiot, before it's corrupted by education and the other, and even the mother for that matter, right? There is some truth to the fact that the baby is, naive and pristine and innocent, and to some extent it is, but it also has a lot built in. And so, for example, in ancient Greece, there was this concept of the idiot. The idiot was someone who was not exposed to education and not exposed to Western democracy. And they saw that he had a lot of genius insights into the world that other people did not have, that were blocked out for other people. And it's because he did not get, education. He did not get the name of the Father, right? And he did not get the imposition of society onto him, in the form of language, in the form of words. He is free to experience the depths of the mind. And it's why, genius shouldn't be regarded more as someone who's super smart. It should be thought of more as the faculty of genius, of genesis, of where thought begins. All right, could you guys at least see the circles as I drew them to say and does that help at all with neurosis, name of the Father, psychosis, no name of the Father, ordinary psychosis, millennial psychosis, no name of the Father, but a sort of stand-in for it, a compensatory make-believe, a fantasy that is compensating for the absence and lack of the father and the name of the father. You can see that there?
Yes, Peter, just a time check.
Okay.
Sorry, my cats are having a major fight on the ground below me. But we have about another 15, you've got about another 15 minutes, and then we'll stop for questions and comments, if that's okay, Peter.
That's perfect. Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I need multiple smoking breaks myself, so I'm going to use this vape to suffice. Okay, so now we have an idea of a sketch, at least, of ordinary psychosis. Do we get this? It's people who we believe have a psychotic structure, and now this is where I'm adding, because Miller does not say this. I'm pointing out those traits, the splitting traits of, millennials and everyday society today. I'll read you two of them as a reminder from that list. Splitting, especially of the other who cannot be tolerated or is needed excessively, being triggered. Triggered is a word from schizophrenia literature. It means his psychotic break was triggered. You only used it to describe the triggering of a break into schizophrenia. Now it got adapted, but that is indeed, right? How everyone experiences their symptom is by being triggered into these sort of psychosis-like state. And so it's why I do think there's some truth to people getting more narcissistic and having more tendencies towards sort of it's what you see is symptoms like personality disorder, and it's why some of the most popular contemporary mainstream therapies are dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, and mentalization, which is made essentially for personality disorders, but now it's being given to everyone. But the facets, personality disorders have always had similarities with psychotic phenomenological behavioral traits. And I think we know very well, we can imagine someone with a so-called personality disorder acting very similar to a bipolar person, right? Who is considered nosologically psychotic for sure. So there's an idea by the Millerians of, that's Lacan's son-in-law, the hires of Lacan, of ordinary psychosis, which is saying that we essentially live in a more psychotic era because of the fall of the paternal metaphor. Okay, so now we're coming full circle to the beginning. And do we get the connection? I had to bring it up at the beginning to explain the backdrop of how all this happens is predicated historically on this fall of the father figure, the fall of the paternal metaphor. And for Lacanians who believe that this installation of the father role, of the name of the father, is what dictates whether one is neurotic or psychotic, the fall of the paternal metaphor through history up to our current point is why everyone, well, a lot of more people would seem to have a psychotic structure, even though they don't present florid psychotic symptoms like schizophrenia. And this is what Millerians call ordinary psychosis. And what I'm calling, when I point out the splitting, for example, when I point out the triggering, all these, the act of canceling the other and that which doesn't fit into giving criteria of acceptable, that is my stuff. That is me pointing out the similarities between how the early psychiatrists describe psychosis, the traits of psychosis, and what we see as commonplace, symptomatic perhaps, but behavior nonetheless of millennial subjects. So my theory is indeed that we are more psychotic today and that there's a real reason for this with the fall of the paternal metaphor and see, Lacanians also don't talk about the absence of, actual men, of the fathers. I think that does play a big role. I think it's politically incorrect to say it, but it's not just the name of the father. I think it's the literal, fall of man's society, man's place in a family, man's place in society, and indeed the patriarchal role of institutions, because they are painful. It makes sense why you hate the patriarchy, right? Because it hates you. It is trying to say no to you. You can't, the patriarchy tells you what you can't do, because the law tells you what you can do. The law does not tell you what you can do. It tells you exactly what you cannot do. And that's what makes society. But that's also, if you believe as I do, what structures the individual and what makes them not psychotic. So for example, we are not going back. That's the thing. Okay, so this is where the sort of conservative, revisionist, it's happening all over the world, right? They obviously want to return to the place of the father and the place of patriarchy. And it makes sense, right? When because you do see things getting more chaotic. However, there won't be a return. There is no going back. However, and this is where the liberals are also wrong, there's also no consensus that the fall of these structures is a good thing either. I mean, we could be going into complete and utter total chaos. So that being said, I think this psychosis, actually, my gamble is that it's a liberating progression, but is going to be very chaotic for a while, because psychotics, and now we're moving into the final portion of my lecture about working with the contemporary subject and working with psychotics, and I'm basing it off of classical work with psychotics. The psychotic has to find their very own specific, highly particular solution to life. And so, for example, with autists, there's the joke with autistic people, that once you've met one autist, you've met one autist. I like it because the logic of it is very autistic, but also it's just saying they're all so different, right? That you almost can't even call it autism, because everyone's specific subjectivity and strategies, cognitive strategy, is so radically different from the other. Yeah, I'm reading a comment from someone. I'll come back to it. It's very interesting to be saying that there's technology companies are hiring more autistic people. Yes, Silicon Valley has known that. And now, see, my dream, for example, is to make a campus to set these sort of millennials free. I mean, Google and Facebook have known for years that we have an autistic generation, and they exploit it for work. I will get back to your comment. I think another word you could use, for example, about today's people is autistic-esque. I don't like to do it because it's not the same thing as autism. It's a generalized psychotic. It's, again, closer to its development being stalled, but specifically at the place of about the time of, nonetheless, of the time of the beginning of the Oedipus complex, weaning, through adolescence. So there now we have a concept of the name of the father and the fall of it over time, and I hope we got that. We have a definition of identity, psychosis, the definition of psychosis and schizophrenia, he or she who splits, and then the theory of ordinary psychosis, that everyone is more psychotic today, and my observations about millennial psychosis and how they share traits. And that's what I like to want to collect when I write this all out, is illustrating how these early psychiatrists really did point out traits that are remarkably similar to what in these autistic and schizophrenic people, which didn't reflect them so much, but reflects millennials today. I just want to, we have about 5 minutes, you think? I wanted to close with some notes about how to work with the psychotic subject today, with the contemporary subject, with the millennial. And now to return to what Alexia brought up, it's a term that Darian Leader actually found, the Lacanian British psychoanalyst, found in in usage of again, early psychiatrists that they called, since they couldn't work with, they believed like Freud that you wouldn't work sort of, therapeutically with psychotics, which they're calling, they're talking about schizophrenics, and they suggested instead be called the secretary of the alienated subject. Lacan also riffs off of this when, in his indications of how to work with psychosis, he says the analyst must be a secretary to the insane. And so what does this mean? This means, this is for the clinicians in the audience, this means you do what a secretary would do. You listen to words, you maybe take some notes, you point out where it could be organized a little bit, but you don't tell them what to do in the same way that a secretary wouldn't tell her boss what to do, but you help them organize. You don't see, and by the way, I mean, this is why, someone like Jordan Peterson is addressing the fall of the paternal metaphor. He doesn't use that language, right? But he's talking about the fall of these father roles in society, and people are hungry for it. People don't have these father figures, both developmentally in the sense of the name of the father and actual, these father figures. And so people are quite hungry for it. And therapists, shitty therapists, capitalized off of this. And of course, today's kids are hungry to be told what to do, and therapists will give them instructions of how to live life. But that's completely horrible because the psychotic can't take instructions from anyone. And you see this, right? You say, they beg, they want to know what to do, and yet you don't tell me what to do, right? Because there's something fundamentally true about that only they can teach themselves. So the secretary of the alienated subject, the secretary of the millennial psychotic, becomes someone just reorganizing what's already there, what's already functioning, their psychotic solution that's already functioning, and you just point out how to make it work. And again, I think it's a term of Peter Dobey, the French analyst, but I like this term a lot. Today's generation of millennials have canceled their subscription to the unconscious, because you can't work with them in the same way that a classical Freudian would. They're just not going to get it at a fundamental level. And so, right, even going back to earlier psychiatrists after Freud, when they started working with psychotics, they always said, and it makes a lot of sense, don't put the psychotic on the couch. I disagree with this, by the way, but they say don't put the psychotic on the couch, basically meaning don't put a schizophrenic on the couch. It's the same reason you wouldn't want a schizophrenic in your living room, right? You kind of get that intuitively. But it's also saying, they are experiencing a great amount of persecution, a great amount of anxiety, a great amount of hostility. You don't want to put them in a place where they can't see your face and are just hearing alienated, essentially delusional, words from a father figure. They can't hear it because they have no access to the name of the father. They have no access to any of this ontological, metaphysical realm that the classical unconscious dwells in, because the classical unconscious dwells in repression, and they don't have repression. In fact, we see this very well. Everything is at the surface. They're not hiding anything. In fact, they want to tell you everything, and it's all there to be told. They just can't put it together themselves. So the new unconscious, the unconscious of today, is really how yourself gets hidden from yourself. And the contemporary analyst, the secretary of the alienated subject, the secretary of millennial psychosis, just helps them in a very tactile way and in a very smart way that involves a reading of the unconscious, but it helps them put the logic of their dream together with why they are doing this over there and why they are reacting that way. And indeed, even Jacques-Alain Miller suggested to most of the World Association of Psychoanalysts, he said, for most of your young people, they're not going to belong on the couch. They're going to belong face to face, more of an interactive way. It's not this, shrouded entity of the unconscious, because they're not accessing it. Why? Because they're not repressed and because they don't have the name of the father, castration, installed in early development, or they have just a substitute. And finally, in 1 minute, and I'll just say a brief thing about my own practice, I work predominantly with artists, I call it psychoanalysis for artists, and indeed most of them have a psychotic structure, but they tend to have their solution in art making. And indeed, Lacan, in one of his main seminars on psychosis, where he talks about James Joyce, this is late Lacan, where he talks about the need for the synthome, what he calls the synthome, which is a play on words, which means synthetic homme, synthetic man, the homme for French, synthetic man. The psychotic individual, he thought James Joyce was psychotic, needs to unconsciously create a new synthetic compensatory make-believe in the place where the name of the father is not, in the place where castration is not. And that can be a really, really beautiful thing. Indeed, Lacan gives James Joyce's poetry as what keeps him stitched together, as what keeps him from going into a florid psychosis. And even if they don't make art, it's about fostering this synthome, allowing them to unconsciously create the meaning making that needs to keep them together that typically the father would have done, and to do it like you would with a child, because that's what they are. Let's leave it there.
Thank you, Peter. That was fantastic. And I wish there were a few more millennials here to be listening to this. We are a little bit over time, so I'm not going to take up too much space, and I'm just going to get straight to questions. Please, let's have Stephen. I see your hand up. Let's go. Yeah.
Thank you, Lex. First of all, Peter, thank you. That was a tour de force. Thank you. That was really, really helpful. It was, if I may say, it seemed to be very structured and unpsychotic. So you didn't provide.
I don't know about that.
You didn't provide an example of psychosis, but you certainly provided us with a wonderful exposition on the topic. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and thank you so much for this evening's talk. I will keep my comments very brief because I'm sure there are many questions. I was picked up on a few things. I'll just focus on one particular question, Peter, which is, I was wondering what your thoughts are, or if you want to refer to the literature, with regards to at what point splitting sort of moves from, let's say, the neurotic to the psychotic structure. At what point do you think splitting, what are the characteristic elements that would, let's say, differentiate splitting in the neurotic from the psychotic structure?
Yeah. Do you have another question, or is it?
No, I'll leave it at that here. I'm sure there are other questions.
It's a really good question, and it's actually at the heart of how or why one would make a distinction between a neurotic and a psychotic in general. And actually, there's two ways for psychoanalysts, at least, to think about structure. For Lacanians, I think they tend to be a bit too rigid here, but they do strict with the binary neurotic psychotic, with the exception of the Millerians, which the rest of the Lacanians are against, who think there's a sort of middle ground. And then there's the sort of American object relations idea that there are no structures because neurotic people, for example, engage in psychotic behaviors sometimes. For example, you're a perfectly normal person, falls madly in love, and they start having psychotic identification with the person. I'm just like them, right? Oh my God, they're just like me. That's a form of psychotic / return to baby core behavioral thing. So the verdict is not out as to if we do probably, most of us to some extent engage in extremes, in sort of psychotic traits and in splitting. And in splitting indeed is a sort of human thing. But that's why I bring up the definition, of the original word for schizophrenia, is that that's what's happening all the time for the schizophrenic, and what's in psychosis, including, I would say, a millennial psychosis. You see the splitting more evidently, which is, isolated as such, especially psychotic, right? And the schizophrenic, that's what they're doing all the time. So, but indeed, neurotics have psychotic traits, and then to the point of the ordinary psychosis is saying there's nothing different about them. They're completely ordinary. In fact, maybe more ordinary and normal, and we see that, right? Millennials like to think they're very individualistic, but in fact, they just borrow things from everyone, and it's quite formulaic. So more ordinary than ever, and actually, we're trying to put our mind on autopilot with how we live life. We're trying to be more ordinary than ever. But neurotic and psychotic, in my opinion, are only good distinctions for how one should work clinically with someone. And otherwise, but there is a spectrum. There is a spectrum for sure. And I think splitting is on the psychotic end of the spectrum.
Thank you, Peter. That helps a lot. Thank you.
I see Chuck has his hand up.
Yeah, in some ways, I've wondered kind of, aren't a lot of these things, all of these, let's say, vacuums that have been formed, and particularly in postmodernism and post-structuralism, aren't really all of these things with the death of God, or the death of what Lyotard would talk about, let's call it the death of the meta-narrative, that's become the new narrative of postmodernism, to say, well, there is no God, or there is no narrative now, and yet that becomes the new narrative, that one is not allowed to speak in terms of overarching institutional things. And so then you see the same metaphor then carrying through with the new castration or the new excommunication, as that a person is then tossed out of the community, even though the community refuses to identify itself as such. But nonetheless, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks, it's a duck. And so what you have is then you have this new castration, which is the cancel culture, or the naming of a person as a heretic. Okay, so now you're a transphobe, or you're a homophobe, or you're a racist. And so you have these new ways in which a person becomes the new heretic against the new God of post-structuralism. And I just wonder if some of these things are actually kind of like fixed in us. And so we just renamed what's going on in culture now. Actually, it's the same old game, just new names, and you're no longer allowed to use the old name.
Well,
I don't know. Okay, thank you.
That is one way of looking at it, just to say, for example, well, do we just have new things functioning as the name of the Father, right? I don't think so. I think it's different than the original, for example, but right, because you have people saying they're completely fluid now, right? They don't have a narrative, they don't have a discourse. Now, I that's skeptical. They say they're really fluid, and then completely identify with trans discourse and only trans discourse. And if you question anything outside of that discourse, then you're transphobic, right? So it's a splitting reaction, right? Everything that's not trans discourse is considering a hostile, other, alienating, bad object, bad breast. I do think this no narrative as new narrative is correct in one way. That is to say, they're stealing narratives from the other all the time. But this is why those identity politics are rather artificial, right? Because they're compensating for something else. So on one hand, the new narrative is no narrative, but because they're stealing, narratives from the other and taking it, identity from the other and taking it as their own. However, those will never be as stable as the sort of deontic powers, of God, money, and the Constitution and the institution of marriage. Those had much more powerful forces. Again, paternal, patriarchal forces indeed, and that's why they were powerful and painful. And right, it's why we don't really want a return, right? A return also gets you to the Middle Ages, but because that's right, it's the harsh, there's a harsh, brutal, rabid father is no father at all. However, there's something artificial if you say that no narrative is the new narrative, because these are not authentic narratives. However, at the individual level, I think their narrative that can spring originally from them will be stronger than ever, because they're not blocked off by the name of the father. I mean, this is the thing about hysterics. Hysterics is a form of neurosis. Neurotics, they love and hate their partner. They really get off on the loving and hating. Psychotics, no. For psychotics, they either really like the person or they don't like the person. For the psychotic, the world is their problem. And you hear that from them, right? They say, nothing is wrong with me at all. I just don't know how to get money for this. I don't know how to do that. And they're actually speaking the truth. Like the child who needs to learn from experience, you just shouldn't get in the way of them, and they know their own answer. They don't know they have their own answer, but it's within them. And it's especially within them because they don't have the imposition of the paternal, no, you can't do that. For them, they could do everything. There's no law to tell them what they can't do. And so they're going to experiment in every possible way. But that usually does not lead to a stable sense of identity or happiness, for that matter. That needs to come not from the compensatory, ripped off artificial discourse of identity politics, but something much more fundamental.
Thanks for that, Peter. It just gets more and more interesting, and I'm sure we have a lot. Oh, I see Adam.
Let me read her comment as well that I brought up.
Yeah, let's have Adam first,
Sure.
and then move on to Lavinia's comment.
All right, thanks, Alexi and Peter. Yeah, there was a great talk. I wanted to go piggyback off CMC's comment about how sort of the new meta narrative is that meta narratives or grand narratives, or as you call it, the name of the father is not allowed. One thing I find interesting is that, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on this, that not only is there not, they're in your and my generation, millennials, they're not being, possession of the name of the father, but even the mere desire for that is sort of a taboo. So even, since given how fundamental desire is to the Lacanian subject, there's this even a mere sort of wanting this, even if either it's on one level you can't get it, or you're understanding, okay, well, this chaos is bad, but this sort of regression to this sort of as Middle Ages sort of authoritarianism would be worse. Even this very kind of fundamental desire is repressed and not even acknowledged as a desire, even a fantasy-based desire.
Not everyone is psychotic, but the psychotics are louder. We can say that, and taking up a huge proportion of society. So I'll give you an example. A lot of women want to be hysteric. I mean, a majority of women who come to me, their fundamental question is, can I be a woman? Am I allowed to be a woman? Is it okay for me to be subordinated by my male partner? Is it okay to be loved by a father? Is it okay to love the person you hate and hate for the person you love? I think these, because I sort of latched on, when you said desire, because I do think this psychotic desire is not for everyone, but that also there's a nostalgia among the psychotics for that, right? So it also makes sense that people love Jordan Peterson, right? They desperately want that. they and need that organization. That's a little bit different than your question, though, which I'm going to ask you, maybe knowing you at least, to reformulate, because I latched on when you said about desire. I like reformulation. Can you clarify again the question, just quickly?
Yeah, that there's I'm wondering, so I guess if what the impact might be of sort of this repressed desire for any, well, A, if it's repressed, if the desire is gone, or if it's just repressed, and B, what the impact would be of this desire for sort of, cause like you've said, there's a fetishization of flux and fluidity, and any desire for anything that's sort of stable and kind of eternal, and kind of is being rather than becoming, to put it in sort of my kind of philosophical language, is seen as really a kind of a fascist move. So any sort of ontological core is seen as fascist.
Well, let me give you the best example.
you know.
This is incredibly controversial, obviously, but I think these protests in the United States demanding for the the canceling of the police is quite literally saying, get rid of the paternal metaphor, get rid of the patriarchy's no, literally get rid of the law, right? It is a demand asking for it to be removed. And yet I think it's as equally a demand for it to be placed in there. I think they want to both tear down the father and are desperate for a new father to replace it, right? So it affects the desire immensely, because there's a gaping hole where fathers used to be. So people are also going to be very hungry for, and so that's why you can understand conservatives' desires, right? It makes a lot of sense to want this stuff back, because things are turning into chaos. So there's also going to be, anytime you have longing, which is what it is, the longing for the father figure, there's going to be attempts to replace it. And I think the unconscious strategy of ordinary psychosis is one compensatory measure. There's going to be the fetishization of it, as you see with people who cling to traditionalism and conservatism, this sort of revisionist thing. But again, I don't think there is a going back. So that's why that has a naivete to it. But there is going to be a nostalgia and a melancholia. There's going to be, for a lot of people, a great depression that they'll never be able to get over the death of the father. And there is. I mean, that has been going on for centuries, of course, but I think it's going to be becoming more marked. Yeah, it's a very good question. That would take a long time to suss out, but it certainly affects the level of desire.
Yeah, I guess before I let the next person speak, I guess one issue I see is that, because I agree with you simultaneously that the current situation is very sort of chaotic and dangerous, but at the same time it would be very dangerous to sort of revert back to the
and
old archaic name of the father. And I think just one sec, Peter. I just want to say, I think one big issue I see right now is really a lack of allowance of people to sort of mourn this loss, which we both it would be very unwise to try to return to, if not impossible, and yet was very important. I mean, I think there's really this real rush of people to not even undergo a mourning process for this loss.
Well, right, no one would.
I think the only way to.
No one would be okay with saying, for example, today, you should be sad about the death of the patriarchy. You're not allowed to say that, but you totally should be. It would be the same way as talking to someone about if their dad died. Yes, it is incredibly, incredibly sad. Yes, it's going to be incredibly hard. Yes, your life is about to fall apart. You are going to be sad for a very long time. Indeed, it has major repercussions, but I don't think it's all bad. I think it is ultimately liberating, in the same way one wants to fucking kill and run away from their dad, right? Again, it's very Oedipal. I think, and so we have to go into a lot more, but I think the psychotic is a more natural place, and that the the very nature of the father is, indeed partially perverse. But point is, there's no verdict, and we don't know what's going to happen. For now, there's a gaping hole in the vacuum, and I think a lot of this aggression is what's filling this gaping hole. And it is chaotic, as we know. The structure is really breaking down, and COVID is going to make this much more of an autistic experience. Everyone is already much less structured, And on that note, the tech relationship to how it engenders our existence. Let me just quickly read off that comment that was made in reference by.
We'll read Lavinia's comments. Do you want me to do it?
Sure, please. Yeah.
And then we'll have like one more question, and then I think we have to wrap up.
Okay.
Okay, so Lavinia's comments is this. In reference to autistic people, I read recently that big technology companies are now making a point to hire more autistic people to be at the forefront of the new AI trends, because they tend to think differently, see patterns, are singularly focused, not readily swayed by external stimulations, don't get attached to company politics, and are perceived to be able to hold vast amounts of information in their minds. So their very weirdness/affliction has become their draw card and has made them highly sought out as employees. They are referred to as non-neuronormative employees. I know, Peter, you are as you say, your dream is to do something.
I know exactly what they're talking about. I would be, if I knew programming, I would be considering one of these people, quite literally. I'm from Silicon Valley to some extent. I was raised in the middle of nowhere, but Silicon Valley, I was homeschooled, incidentally. I should mention that. I think it's very important to say that I was raised in an extremely sheltered in one way, sheltered not in another, but nonetheless, also the domain of the mother, and I consider myself one of these psychotic millennials, if not one of these autistic-esque ones. Indeed, Silicon Valley companies know very well about all of these autistic traits that you explained, and indeed the keyword, the buzzword is atypical, and that's why drugs now prescribed are called atypical antipsychotics. Well, that's actually not the reason. That's molecular, but they're also for that reason. It refers to someone correct me. What is the word for? They call it neurotypicals, right? There's neurotypicals, and then there's everyone else, the non-neuronormative employees. Well, I guess I said what I wanted to say is that they capitalize on, but it is this, for me, that's just more clues. So one, there are rising rates of autism that are through the roof in Silicon Valley because these people meet at Google and Apple where they work and have children. And I think autism is different, though part of the psychotic family, and probably does have genetic markers. And why I said I thought autism is separate, though I do also consider it a psychosis, because I can imagine very well, and I think you can as well, an autistic-like person who doesn't have any genetic markers and is like that. And I think that comes from a severe, but as you're seeing why we call it autism spectrum now, less and less severe, right? And I think COVID is engendering, right? With COVID, we are all in our shells. And before that, right, half of us walked down the street with earbuds in our ears in a totally solipsistic, autistic shell. So, and for example, if someone like Greta, I think autism itself might be a giant reaction, for example, to global warming and a protective mechanism. So a lot of these things, of course, like any psychological mechanism, are defense mechanism. And I didn't even say that, splitting is always a defense, and compensatory identity issues are a defense, right? So identity, taking it from the other as they do in identity politics, is a defense. And I think you see that characteristic very clearly, how in today's reactions. A lot to say about the autism thing. My idea is eventually to make a maison verte, that's Francis Adalto was a Lacanian who made a children's school ran by psychoanalysts, where really all they did was play. And I think, and you know, they make these campuses, Google campus, Facebook campus, Apple campus, like playgrounds. For example, you don't have to pay for anything. There is no name of the father. You don't have to pay for anything. It's on the house. The mother takes care of it, right? You're in the nursery school. Now, however, and so Maison Vert is a psychoanalytic school that they set up entire towns for autistic children in France. So, for example, instead of the ABA sort of behavioralist, fix it this way of American disciplinarian inspired autism treatments, they work in a fashion where they just let them play, where they just let them be children, but then also they put them to work, which I like. They, for example, will put an autistic child very early on to work in a bakery in one of these towns. So they're part of the process of making being, to get to the title of my lecture finally at the very end, is that in our age, one has to work with what unconscious processes are already making their identity and making their being. And the analyst, for example, helps them piece that puzzle together. Now, the corporations, Google and Facebook, are taking advantage of the other things you said, you know, their focus, and the other things you see with these, you know, hyper focus, the flip side of ADHD, and their playfulness itself, right? They're rather naive. You can take advantage of them and capitalize off of their work ethic, interest, and their general naivete very easily. I hope to someday make a campus that does the opposite, that turns them into the Ubermensch, which is how we started, because the Ubermensch is someone who takes their identity from themselves, from their original core, and borrows from themselves to install the name of the father onto themselves. And yeah, let's leave it there. That's a good solution.
Thank you, Peter. John is going to ask the last question.
Great.
John, you unmute.
Unmute the mic. You should have just left it on the whole time. It goes for all of you. You got it, John, on the left lower hand side. Mute microphone icon.
You were off mute a sec. Oh, there we go.
There you go.
I think I'm here now.
I
forgot to do that.
Glad to have you.
No, I was going to say, Peter, thank you for that talk. It was wonderful. But I had a question, which was that, do you think that this loss of the paternal metaphor has something to do, or a lot to do, with the millennial sense of identity? They've lost the paternal metaphor, so now that's disintegrated and they kind of feel like they're on their own. Can you elaborate on?
Yeah, I mean, everyone would be very alone. And what's interesting here is, as Freud points out, the father is a very lonely position, because in some ways, everyone hates the dad. The dad just tells them what not to do. However, the dad also instills, as God does, right? What do you go when you're really lost? You eventually find the father, or many people go searching for the father, or indeed, you know, cheap substitutes like drugs, but that kills you. That it would make sense. You don't have someone with you at all times. You don't have that sense of belonging installed both by the name of the father and the nature of institutions themselves, and these mechanisms such as God, the church, the nation state, these things you can grasp onto, these things you can hold onto, are gone. So you would be very, very alienated and very lonely. And that would be a crucial part of your identity, which leaves a lot of space to be filled, which unfortunately, again, so why it's compensated usually by sort of, cheap stand-ins. But there really is a lot of opportunity at a fundamental level for the psychotic individual, given as long as they're not, completely, catatonic or the worst parts of florid schizophrenia. That's just an acknowledgement of, yes, it would make sense that the loneliness would be profound. And autism, of course, is a profound loneliness, right? It's just being with oneself, the automatic individual, the bubble, the one all alone is how the Lacanians in France call it. But is that what you were getting at or no?
No, that hit the nail on the head. Thank you. That was, yeah.
Okay. I think, unfortunately, we have to come to an end, everyone.
I just saw my mother. I will say hi, Mom. I will say that.
Oh, wow. Hi, Peter's mom.
Well, I won't say about her relationship to the name of the father, but you can take a guess. Go on, Alexa.
So I just want to say thank you so much, Peter. That really was fantastic. And I have quite a few questions, but I will keep those for maybe the Facebook forum. And just to say that this is the first type of program course that we're doing on identity. And it would be really great if we could hear from everyone on the Facebook forum.
Yeah. And then now I'll be more active on it, now that I finally got out what I needed to say. So I'll be there.
Okay, cool. John, you are not on the Facebook forum, but if you would like to be, we weren't sure, like, because you are our very special guest, but if you would like to, we can chat about that, but it's just the Facebook forum for everybody that's on this program. But I just wanted to say it would be fantastic to get some feedback from all of you in terms of the course and, you know, where it's been and where it's going. And yeah, I just feel that there's a lot of very important stuff being said, and I'm sure we're still digesting John's lecture, and now it's Peter. Next week we have Stephen with the freak, which is a term that Stephen will elaborate on more, and Jung's second personality with regards to identity. And yeah, and then we have the final closing panel the following week. But it would just be great to hear from you guys on the Facebook forum. Yeah, just to get a sense of this whole concept.
Wait, who lost? Did Trump lose? Who was talking about that?
No. So Tay said that Trump lost. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, he did, and indeed, he, like I said today, he was saying that, you know, he won literally the opposite of that. I want it big. So it's Trump is psychotic, by the way. No one has the vocabulary in America to know about this. But in the general sense, and obviously, you know, narcissistic personality disorder, it's actually not narcissistic personality disorder. It's deeply psychotic, and it would make sense. But that he pushes out, and the name of the father for him, the compensatory one, is, for example, you know, winning, money. He can't even imagine the idea of loser. So it's immediately projected and split off. Indeed, that's why the country is going to be just as split as it is, because their cheap substitute father is, is about to have a fucking breakdown. But right, that's why Biden is essentially saying, you know, I am the name of the father, remain calm, you will get through this. And that is, of course, a paternal role that you don't find much of today, and people are hungry for it.
Okay.
It's a sort of a very quiet hunger. All right.
Yeah, it's been.
Maybe it got more severe while I was. Wow, you're right. There it is on the screen. President-elect. I could have just looked left the entire time. That's incredible. It's an amazing cut. We can leave it on. It's a structuring cut, because that's a substitute name of the father. But at least we had before that, Trump was sort of, you know, a rabid, a violent father. Trump was the equivalent of a violent father, which is no father at all.
Great. Okay, everyone. Well, on that note,
I guess I can do that because he's not president now. All right, it's soon to be not be. Okay, I can finally diagnose. Bye.
Thank you.
Ciao. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Peter.
Smoke.
Bye. That was amazing. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I need to smoke.
Goodbye.